Hi, Bio30s. This is the first part of Unit A, which is the nervous system. Living cells can only survive and function within a narrow range of conditions. And homeostasis, which is an important term that we need to know, is the body's ability to keep normal body functions the same stable state despite what's going on around you. Okay, so homeostasis is an important word that we need to know in Bio30, especially in the nervous system and endocrine system, because it is really the body's way of trying to make sure that homeostasis is always happening. So there are four main functions of the nervous system. You don't have to memorize them straight up, but it's that understanding of things coming into our nervous system, we're processing them, and then we're creating responses. So the first main function is that the nervous system receives information and carries it to the central nervous system, which we're going to learn all about. Which is essentially the brain and spinal cord. Once the information is received by the body, it needs to interpret that information. So it interprets information and makes decisions about the response. In terms of those decisions, it's going to need to sort information because there are going to be things that are coming into the nervous system at all times, and our bodies are going to need to sort it in priority order. So it sorts information and sets priorities for action. And then lastly, it transmits information, which is in the form of a response, to the muscles. And when we talk about the endocrine system, it could be a gland. Which will carry out the appropriate action. Again, not important in terms of remembering receives, interprets, sorts, transmit to be able to sort of regurgitate that information, but more that there's this process of our body sensing, sorting, and then responding. And it's all done very quickly, and it's all done really without us noticing most of the time. There are two main types of nerve cells that we talk about. Glial cells are the first type, and the glial cells are the ones we don't talk about very often, but they're really, really important. They're the neurological cells that do not carry an impulse or a charge. So if you think about like an electrical wire carrying information or carrying electricity to your house, if that electrical wire wasn't working, electricity wasn't being carried through it, then a glial cell would be something like that. So what is the purpose of a glial cell? Glial cells are there for structural or nutritional support of the active nerve cells that actually carry the charges. So they don't carry an impulse or a charge and are used for structural or nutritional support in the nervous system. Just had to do some erasing there. The neurons, however, they're the neurological cells that do versus do not carry an impulse or a charge, which we're going to learn about what those are, and are used to communicate messages through the body. An analogy that I like to use when I'm talking about it is there was the electrical wire that I just mentioned, but we can just look at an analogy of everything that's in an electrical wire. So let's look at an electrical wire carrying an impulse. That could be the neuron. And then the rubber insulation that's around the electrical wire, that could be a glial cell. So think about your cell phone charger, right? You've all probably had a cell phone charger where you've had it long enough that it starts to sort of tear a little bit right at the plug or right at the side that it plugs either into your device or into the wall, and you can see some wires exposed. You should probably get a new one if that's the case. But that rubber that's around it, so that white wrapping or the black wrapping that's around it, that would be like a glial cell. So it would be a supporting cell. And inside are the wires, and they're the ones that are carrying that charge that is going to be charging your cell phone coming from the wall outlet. So when we look at neurons themselves, neurons and nerves are sometimes two words that are used interchangeably, but they're actually different things. A neuron is just a single nerve cell. A nerve is actually a bundle of neurons. So it's just important to be able to differentiate those two terms. So neurons or nerve cells are the basic unit of the nervous system, and a nerve cell is actually a bundle of individual neurons. And you can see in this picture below, that is just a single neuron or a nerve cell. So imagine a bundle of those. So if I was to take a whole bunch of those, if there was a bunch of them laying in a bucket and I could scoop as many up in my hand as I could and then wrap something around them, that would be like a nerve. Or again, if you go back to your cell phone charger, sometimes if you've bent that rubber insulation enough that the wires are poking out, there isn't just one wire in there, there's a whole bunch wrapped around. All of those individual wires would be the neurons, and the whole thing together would be a nerve. So neurons are composed of a cell body and a number of branch-like extensions. The cell body, we don't want to forget that a cell body is no different in terms of its basic functioning as we remember a cell that we learned back in Science 10 or in junior high. So if you think of your normal cell that we used to talk about, we still talk about, it's important, right? You've got your nucleus. We know that the nucleus has DNA in it, right? There's endoplasmic reticulum around the nucleus. There's mitochondria, there's ribosomes, some of them on the endoplasmic reticulum. There's Golgi apparatus, there's some small vacuoles or lysosomes. Just like a cell that we've learned about, this nerve cell is just a specialized type of cell. So it still has a cell body. As you can see, here's the nucleus. You've probably got some mitochondria in there, some other organelles, but it's specialized and it has differentiated to serve its function. So it's grown some short branches and then one extra long branch. It's important to know these names. The dendrites are the short branches that come off of the main body of the nerve cell. The dendrites are going to receive carried messages toward that cell body, that main part of the cell that we learned about in Science 10. And then there's a long branch that branches off of that cell body, and that is called an axon. So we have dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. So if I was to do coloring, and this is what we would be doing in class, and I recommend you do it, it's a good way to sort of get to know structures. So that would be the cell body, and then over on the right here where it says cell body, oops, I colored in the O instead of the dot, but you should catch my drift there. You've got it red, so that's showing that that's the cell body. So then what I can do here is I can go, okay, then the dendrites are going to be these branches. So I would color in these branches, and they're just the short ones, and those would be the dendrites. And then the axon, I'll make green, and there it is. So those are the three main structures that we're talking about. One thing that is key to notice in what I've written here is that information comes in from the dendrites towards the cell body, and then it goes out through the axon. So there's really one-way traffic flow when we're talking about traffic or information being taken through a neuron. So we call this the direction of impulse. The direction of impulse in the neurons that we talk about in Bio 30 is always going to be from dendrite to cell body to axon and out, always in that order. There's a specialized and even more specialized nerve cell down below here, and that nerve cell looks a little bit different because it has an extra coating on it. So axons might be coated in a fatty coating called myelin. And myelin is made up of a certain type of cell called a Schwann cell, and it's named after Schwann of Schwann and Schleiden, who did a lot of work on cell research 100 years or so ago. And Schwann cells are just a special type of glial cell. And there's small gaps between each Schwann cell that are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so there's quite a few terms here that we're learning. We've got dendrites, axon, myelin, Schwann cell, nodes of Ranvier. The purpose of that myelin, or the myelin sheath meaning that it covers the whole axon, is that it increases the speed of nerve transmission. It's important to know that that is its function. It makes it, like I like to describe it to help you learn it a little bit better, is I describe it as that it makes it a little bit slippery. And so it allows that nerve impulse to be passing through that neuron faster than those axons that aren't myelinated, like in the example above that we colored. So here you can see a few more details about a myelinated neuron. Again, you'd still have the same direction of impulse from dendrite to cell body and out. So if we were going to follow the direction of impulse on this one, it would be going in this direction. So incoming messages on this one side here, sending the message through the axon to the end. And the terms that you need to know, we already talked about here, is the cell body. That would be this area right in here. The nucleus, you should know where that is, sitting inside the cell body in the nucleolus. You can see some mitochondria in there too. Those nerves are very active and they need energy. So one of the main organelles, or you're going to see more organelles, or mitochondrial organelles inside a neuron than maybe some other type of cells. The dendrites you can see as well. Maybe color those red. So here's some dendrites, the short branches. And then you've got your long axon. So I'm going to color that yellow all the way to the end. And we get a little bit specific at the end here. So the axon I've colored yellow, so that'd be color in my yellow dot. When you get to the end of the axon, you get to the axon terminal. So I'll just choose some other colors here. So making my axon terminal sort of this purpley pink color, hot pink maybe. So that means that we're at the end of the axon and where the axon starts branching out. And then we'll choose a color here for another structure called the end bulbs. Sort of a teal type of a color in here. And those end bulbs are like the end tip of the axon. So the axon is really just the long strand, and then it branches into the terminals and then the end bulbs, and then we're at the total end of that neuron. Also in this image, you can see the myelin sheath on top. So I've shown you kind of two images here of what we want to know or how we see that myelin sheath is wrapping around. So here's the axon, and if I go back to my little color scheme here, right? This yellow piece here is my axon, just associating it with the color I have in the drawing above. The myelin sheath is sort of like you're going to be wrapping a cinnamon roll, right? And you wrap this cell. So this here, this is an actual cell that it almost flattens out and rolls around. It even has a nucleus and everything, just like a cell should. And it wraps around the axon. That is what is happening here. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to identify it exactly in the diagram of that nerve cell here. So if we're going to draw or color the myelin sheath, and I'll just go back to using blue because I haven't used it from the cell body. So the myelin sheath is really this like everything, like this whole section of sort of like jelly beans that are sitting along the axon, which is made up of Schwann cells. So if I go back to using, let's just make it green for now. So these are the Schwann cells that are wrapped around the axon. And then there's another substance that I'll talk about on the next page here called neurolemma. And neurolemma is just a coating that goes on top of each of the Schwann cell. So if I go back to the baking analogy, which I like to do, if this is your cinnamon bun that you rolled around or wrapped around this axon, if you are putting a cinnamon bun in the oven, if you do any baking, sometimes you'll put like melted butter on the top of it just to crisp it up in the oven before you bake it. Neurolemma is sort of like that coating that goes on top of the Schwann cell after it's wrapped on the axon. And neurolemma has the function of giving it some protein and some nutrition that if that neuron gets damaged or the myelin sheath gets damaged, the neurolemma can actually repair it. So what I recommend you do is you go through and you try to color these and really get familiar with what all the structures are. The nodes of Ranvier aren't really a structure as much as they are a gap. So if we look in this here, you can see just this little space in between every jelly bean, as I'm calling it. That would be the node of Ranvier. That would be the gap in between those myelin sheath. They're in between the Schwann cells that make up the myelin sheath, rather. Not all cells are myelinated in our body. We have myelinated ones and unmyelinated ones. It depends where we're looking at. When we look at myelinated neurons overall together, we call them white matter. And that's because they actually have a whiter appearance than those that are unmyelinated, which we call gray matter. Now, because those that are myelinated are more likely to have neurolemma on them, they're also more likely to regenerate when damage happens. So you have a lot of myelinated neurons just in your skin, in your muscles and so on. So if you ever get a paper cut, once it heals, you're able to feel again, right? You might have kind of cut the nerve a little bit, but it ends up healing up itself. Unmyelinated neurons are more likely found in the brain and spinal cord. So if you're to get damage to the brain or spinal cord, you're less likely to have repair in those areas because they don't have that neurolemma component to them. Okay, and I just described that in that second bullet there. One of the conditions that is sort of an important application in Bio30 that we talk about in the nervous system, in particular with myelin, is the disease multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis attacks the myelin sheath and it affects nerve transmission. And if we think about what the function of the myelin sheath is, and it's to increase the speed of nerve transmission, then if you're going to have damage to that area, you're going to have a slower speed of nerve transmission in that area, and scar tissue builds up. And so, depending on the form of MS, it can cause issues with movement and even into the brain and spinal cord in terms of, thinking, certain brain functions and so on, depending on the type. Neurons are classified into 4 general types, and there's 2 that we talk about the most. The other 2 I'm going to explain because I think it gives you good perspective on the fact that it's not just one type of neuron we're talking about here. But we just worked on the multipolar neuron. Sort of that's the one that's the last one we looked at. Myelinated multipolar neuron. You can have unmyelinated multipolar neurons too. This one is just showing that it's myelinated. These are generally our motor on our interneurons, and those words will become important a few pages down the road here in the notes. The next one we talk about a lot is the unipolar, which is your sensory neuron. So they have the same structures in them. It's just that some of the parts are in different places. So if we look at our general multipolar, we've got our dendrites here, we've got our cell body, and you've got your axon. You also have dendrites on your sensory neuron or your unipolar, but your cell body is actually a little blip that extends off the axon about halfway in the middle, and there's your axon. So it's sort of an interesting form, but you still have your axon terminals and your end bulbs at the end. It just looks a little bit in structure. The sensory neurons are all the ones that are bringing information into your body, and the motor neurons are the ones that are bringing information back to a body part for you to have a response. And the interneurons are the ones that sit in the spinal cord, and they're sort of like the middleman. The bipolar neurons are ones you see in our special sensory nervous system, for example, in the retina. We don't talk about them a lot. The cell body of that is, rather than it being a blip on the side of the axon, the axon is actually divided into two, where that name bipolar comes from. And then one that is anaxonic, an meaning without an axon, you can see that there's no long extension off of that cell body. Those are sort of a glial cell type of a cell. So it's not going to conduct anything because it doesn't have sort of a start and a finish, like a dendrite to axon pathway of impulse. And it's just a supporting cell. It would be, an example would be that Schwann cell. That would be the thing that's wrapped around the axon. So that's the introduction to what nerves look like for Bio 30.